Sometimes risk requires flexibility, I would say. So thank you for your patience. A couple of reminders as we settle. We have obviously made some exceptions today, but normally we've made exceptions with clothing today. Also a reminder that in chapel we do not, with the exception of today, we do not bring in food or beverages, okay? Again, we're being a little flexible. As Mr. Yoder eloquently spoke about yesterday, our graduate profile, can we get the young man's head up, please? Our graduate profile outlines our goals in 3 different areas: academics, spiritual, and lifestyle choices. And in particular, in lifestyle choices, where we encourage students and alumni to incorporate their intellectual and spiritual learning into a lifestyle which demonstrates 2 pieces that I'd like to comment on: peacemaking in all relationships and a commitment to moral integrity. How will we interact with each other this year? How will we respond when we disagree? How can we disagree in and with love? What is civil discourse? Today's Doc Talk will explore some stories of both civil and, well, frankly, uncivil discourse, give us some tips and ideas on how to do this well, and then look at a story from the Bible of Jesus' meeting with a woman at the well and what that can teach us today. Contributors will include Mrs. Grega, Mr. Hertzler, and Mr. Hackman. As well, I need to add that I have been so appreciative of student involvement so far this year, especially those who have shared in chapel. But in particular, I want to point out the words and deeds of Cedar Smith and McKay Trauger. To hear them stand up here and remind us all to listen and to work hard to fully understand what the other's saying is a quite good thing. I remember them as freshmen, and I don't know that I think that at that point in time they would have said those words with the integrity and maturity that they stated this year. You two both are examples of the Doc graduate profile coming to fruition, and I cannot wait for the rest of the year with the both of you. I'd like to pass on a bit of a story that unfolded over the course of 2 school years. To me, it illustrates several points to the lifestyle goals that we as a school have for you, our potential graduates. In particular, that we will attempt peacemaking in all relationships and have a commitment to moral integrity. Now, from where I sit, this is a remarkable story with a positive ending. But at times, this story was quite painful. Just before Thanksgiving, 2 or 3 years ago, a post was put up on a social media site. I do not recall if it was Snapchat or Instagram. But that post targeted a group of our students. The post was hateful. The post was threatening. I don't know that it was intended as such, but that is certainly how it was received. Days were spent trying to find out who was responsible for this hurtful action. The police were notified. Several days later, and I recall this very vividly, late in the afternoon, early in the evening, I was sitting on the sofa when I received a text from a student. He asked, "Can we speak? I need to see you tomorrow morning. Is that possible?" He said he had been talking to some of his friends, and they said, "Mr. Wiens needs to talk to you." Now, during the course of this texting exchange, he let me know that he was the one who posted the offensive photo with the hateful words on it. Now, you see, he had quality friends. They prayed for him, and they prayed with him. They knew he needed to make things right, and they gave him the courage to do so. True to his word, he and his parents were at school first thing the next morning, and his parents were and are people of excellent quality people, full of integrity. They wanted what was best for the school and those harmed. They also wanted what was best for their son. They were direct. They were supportive. And to be clear, the police and significant time away from this campus were part of the process that he went through to earn his way back into this community. There were meetings facilitated by adults on this campus as we moved forward. Forgiveness was extended, but the cut was still deep. The pain was still deep. Fast forward a year, one full year later, mind you, and a year that had been filled with conversations with people at church, at school, within families, and within the people's respective communities. We were on the Faith Walk retreat, and members of the classes were up at Camp Mennonite. One of the students most deeply impacted by the incident was there on the same evening as the offender, and the students were going to have a time of significant conversation. The young person who had offended and one of his friends approached the person offended and sought to apologize more fully. They wanted the offended person to know the depth and sincerity of their apology. The three spoke for an extended, significant period of time. Again, apologies were given. Again, forgiveness was extended. But this time it was a bit different. This time reconciliation occurred. Reconciliation occurred. The person who gave the forgiveness is to this day one of the strongest people I have ever met. Her actions were some of the most Christ-like actions I have ever seen by a human being. I do not know that I could have done what she had the courage to do. The story doesn't end there. You see, this story emboldened, and the sharing of this story emboldened other people to look at their actions. One student in particular, he had to look at his actions, his words, his deeds. And then he too sought forgiveness from those that he had offended. He recognized that he needed forgiveness, reconciliation, and ultimately transformation. All three of them, at an appropriate time, stood where I am standing right now, and they shared their story of reconciliation and transformation to this school and this student body. And to me, the coolest thing, one of the coolest things I would say out of this whole story, is that when I texted the three of them within the past couple of days and asked their permission to share their story within moments, they all said yes, absolutely. And they are at different places across the states in their dorm rooms right now. You see, they also sat where you are sitting right now, and they do not want you to make the same mistakes they made. They are giving freely to you of who they are, warts and all, in the hopes that you will learn from their stories and that you will receive forgiveness, that you will extend forgiveness, and that you will, most importantly, experience reconciliation. Thank you.
I'm going to turn this so I can talk to this wonderful group over here also. My name is Mrs. Grega, and I'm the learning support person here on campus. And I want to share with you 5 stories that I've experienced in my many years of teaching. After being in the high school classrooms for over 40 years, teaching physical education, health, and sex education before I came to Doc, and then when I was teaching English at Doc, I've encountered many examples of both teachers and students forgetting the golden rule. Mean, disrespectful, hurtful verbal language, facial expressions, and body language are things we all do, often without realizing it, that hurt other people. making fun of friends by laughing at them, the famous roll your eyes, whispering behind our friends' backs. It's not funny to be the target of this abuse, even though many of us think it is. Let me give you a few examples, and some are quite extreme, but they are true, of what has happened to me as a teacher. Flashback to the late 80s. We still didn't know how AIDS was transmitted. Some research said you could get it by sharing a glass with someone or a towel in a locker room. I was charged with teaching my sex ed classes about sexually transmitted diseases and was learning along with the rest of the nation. I was teaching about AIDS, and I had one boy stand up, and I'm thinking he was afraid of catching it, and said, let's just put all those people in a big old barge, put them in the middle of the ocean, and throw a bomb at them and kill them. I was floored, and my class was stunned. That was my first experience with hate as a teacher in the classroom. And I must admit, as a teacher, I can be judgmental. My Catholic school kids wore uniforms. I had no idea how they dressed in their private life. So when I was teaching in New Jersey at a Catholic high school, my husband and I are walking around the mall on a Saturday night, and I'm like, look at that group of kids. They're dressed like goth kids. Do you remember the goth clothing? You know, the eyeshadow, all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, I am glad I don't have kids like that. 2 minutes later, those kids run up to me, Mrs. Grega, how's your weekend going? They were my kids in my health classroom. I was mortified. I didn't know what to do. I apologized to each one individually, but I judged them by what they had on and not the wonderful darlings that I had in my health classroom. Let's pop into Doc, early 2000s. My freshman class was asked to write a poem about their favorite toy. Somebody picked to write about a talking big bird. Now, those of you who are familiar with Sesame Street remember him. You pulled a little lever and he would talk. One young man named Colby, who was born in Haiti, said, "Who is this big bird?" And my kids laughed at him and started making nasty comments. "How stupid you are. How come you don't know that?" Well, Colby had grown up in an orphanage. He had no television, and he had no access to storybooks published by Sesame Street. After class, Colby asked me if the kids would be laughing at him for the rest of the year because he had a fro that was this high, and he was the only non-white kid in my English class. I learned from that experience, and many others, that behind every pair of eyes is a story, and that story we don't always know. Colby taught me how to respect cultural differences and to be more aware of my student backgrounds and prepping them for what was in my English class. Another story, 5 years ago here at Doc. A student from Philadelphia who I had in my English class for 3 years blatantly called me a racist. This happened several times over a 2-year period, and I took it personally. I could not figure out what I was doing wrong, but that person's entire life story was never shared with me. Had he been wronged by white people before? Were the women in his life unfair to him, and maybe I was the target that day? Had his family had horrible experiences with prejudice, and I just happened to be the outlet that day for his anger? I never got an answer from him. Was it easy to handle? No. I had to call Mr. Wiens in to be a mediator because I didn't even want to look at that student because I was so hurt. 2 years later, one of this man's classmates died, and he was a student of mine. A group of us from Doc went to the funeral in Philadelphia. The young man who had called me a racist happened to walk by, and I put my hand out to shake his hand, and he shook my hand and he looked me in the eye and he said, "I'm glad you came." And in that moment, his eyes touching my eyes, I felt we reconciled. He didn't have to tell me why he called me that, and I thought it was my turn to forgive, and it was his turn to apologize in a way that neither of us expected. I will never forget that moment. Right now, we have about 20% of our student population here at Doc from other countries. No one knows everyone's personal background. During the height of the Clinton presidential campaign versus Trump in 2016, more than half of my junior English students were making anti-immigrant statements over a period of several weeks in my class. Each time I heard specifics, we tried to stop and think and talk about each person's opinion without anger and to try to understand each other. And I'll tell you, the civil discourse got really ugly. The worst part was that we had a young man from Liberia in our class. We all loved him, and he was a starter on the varsity soccer team. Very popular boy, and some of you freshmen might remember him. Certainly, I didn't know his immigrant status, nor that of his parents or his extended family. Each time those poisonous words came out of my students, my heart broke. Finally, and I didn't know if I'd get in trouble for this, finally one day when this child was absent, I asked my class, "Why are you saying this stuff? Why are you talking about this boy?" And they said, "Oh, everybody here at Doc is legal." And my statement was, "Well, how do you know? How do any of us know? That's not something we ask as a school or an administration." Well, from that day on, we had better civil discourse. These kids knew a kid that might have been illegal, and they were trashing that population in general, and somehow that stopped. The lesson from this story is to give people who are different from you the benefit of the doubt. Make tolerance and love a part of your thinking process instead of intolerance and hatred. That same junior class responded verbally to an editorial in the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper that I asked them to read. Most of the kids in that class thought the reporter was being very unfair to Donald Trump. I said, "Well, what are we going to do about it?" And a guy named Christian stood up and he goes, "We're writing a letter to the guy who wrote the story." I was like, awesome. All 16 of my kids wrote individual letters to the author of the editorial. His name was Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman. Dr. Zimmerman had written 12 books on how to handle politics and opinions in high school and college classrooms. He responded to every single one of those letters personally to my students and said that maybe he was being unfair and maybe he should look at the big picture when he writes his editorials. From that, my kids said, "Let's invite him to Doc." So he came, he talked to our classroom, and he also addressed the people here in chapel on how to have civil discourse. I think that chapel and follow-up discussions in some classrooms created a more civil tone to get us through that election cycle. I'm very excited that my students took charge to help all of us learn how to communicate better and respect people, even though we disagree with them. And I hope we remember that as the next presidential election looms forward. So the coming year at Doc could be electrically charged with student and faculty disagreements about politics, religion, lifestyle choices, or immigration. That could make Doc a very toxic place to be, and it could make some of us feel targeted or unsafe or set up for ridicule. I know we're better than that, as Mr. Wiens would say. And I challenge all of us, both teachers and students, to be aware of what we say, to use our voice to build others up and not tear each other down, to use our eyes to show that we're listening and respecting each other, because your eyes often speak for your mouth. Let's hold each other accountable and also speak up when others are utilizing language or actions that Jesus would frown upon. And I know that we can achieve that goal this school year. Thank you.
We're not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chorus of the union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Abraham Lincoln, 1861. How do we get in touch with those better angels? How do we have civil discourse? How do we get along with people that we don't agree with? These are all questions that I think are extremely important, as Mrs. Grega said, as we approach another political time in which, frankly, I think the conversations will get ugly. I don't think we have to be like that here at Doc. We can be in touch with those better angels. I was a teenager during the Vietnam War. Maybe the last time that our country was so polarized. As a Mennonite in a large public school, I found very few who understood why I was against the war. Many simply called me names questioning my courage or patriotism, or sometimes they simply called me names. The principal of the school, an ex-Marine, was openly frustrated by my uncomfortableness of saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I would have valued persons other than my identical twin who would have taken an interest in trying to understand why I was against the war. I would have appreciated and valued somebody who was willing to listen, but I never got that when I was in high school. Is that possible? Is it really possible to value and care for somebody who fundamentally disagrees with you in terms of some of your beliefs and values? I think it is, but I believe the key is listening. Could I have the slide up here, please? All juniors will take conflict resolution class, and seniors have had that class, and so I'm going to be asking some of my seniors to help me with, hopefully, some of the things that they've learned along the way. And one of the things that I start with in class is this particular slide. It's coming. Well, it'll be coming. Let me just read part of it here. It says, "Are you really listening, or are you just waiting for your turn to speak?" Hearing happens. Listening is a choice. Active listening implies that for a period of time, you tune out from your own point of view and you tune in to the other person. Yesterday, McCade mentioned that he learned through the course of several years to listen. I think that's a remarkable thing to do. And I think I've asked McCade to come with me today, and what I'd like to do is to model a little bit how perhaps we can listen. One of the things that I know McCade has talked about that might be different than some of our values are some of your economic or political beliefs. So I'd like to find out about that a little bit, McCade. Can you tell me about that?
Sure, absolutely. Should I move this at all, or can you hear me?
Can you hear McCade?
I don't want to hurt
Okay.
anybody's ears or anything.
Okay.
All right, so I would typically align myself with conservatives in government because I believe in small government and empowering the individual to fix problems rather than the government. And I also align myself with smaller issues that conservatives support, like illegal immigration and social welfare.
So one of the things that you're really focused on is this concept of government and how government can serve us. And your belief is that less government is better than more government.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And in terms of your view on immigration, just tell me a little more. You're saying that that's a little bit something that involves government roles then too, or?
Sure. I think that when looking at illegal immigration, we have to make sure that we're giving everyone equal opportunity to come to the United States. We have to make sure that we're not limiting immigration, but rather keeping track of legal immigrants and not letting it get out of control, I guess you could say.
So one of the things you're concerned about is the legality of immigration, making sure persons are legal and are here for appropriate reasons rather than just subverting our system. Is that sort of where you're headed?
Yes, that's correct. For the safety and equality of citizens here.
Now, we could go on like this probably, I think, for quite a while. But what I'm really doing is trying to focus on McCade's perspective, not mine. I may not agree with McCade on everything, but part of what you need to do is to tune out from your agenda and focus on the other person. And you know, just because we disagree, that doesn't mean we can't get along. It's important, I think, to value another person because all of us are created in the image of God and we deserve respect and dignity regardless of that perspective. So thank you, McCade, for being courageous and being willing to do that.
Thank you
I
for listening.
appreciate that. Thank you. I think the other area, and certainly Mr. Wiens gave us a classic example of how social media can ruin relationships. And it's one of those things that I think is particularly difficult when one is trying to maintain a sense of relationship and connection. Jesus in Matthew 18 said, if somebody sins against you, go directly to them and tell them their fault. Talk to that person directly. Texting is not the way to do it. Using Instagram is not the way to do that. Social media doesn't work. I think Jesus understood that you have to go directly to a person and face-to-face have that conversation. Body language, many pieces of that are real important. And so not doing that, using social media destroys everything that allows that face-to-face conversation to happen. I asked Christian here to organize a couple of kind of skits or role plays. The first one is going to show us how social media can really create some problems relationship-wise.
Wow, look at those losers.
So stupid. Dude, I'm going to post this on my Instagram, bro.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. So what do you think happens if that gets posted on Instagram along with some comments that suggest that that's stupid or, they're idiots or some other sort of derogatory kind of language? What really happens is now you have a lot of people that you have really created a relationship problem. So how do you do this?
We're waiting for them, I think. Are we going over to apologize? Yeah. Hey guys, we'd like to apologize for our posts on Instagram.
It won't happen again. I'm sorry. Hope we can still be friends.
Oh, sorry about saying mean things.
Can we get a squad pic?
Yeah, want to join? Yeah. Hop in. Look at this unity. Perfect.
I think what I'd like you to notice is that they went directly and they talked to them. They did not try to avoid that. They did not try to post things. Again, when we're angry, sometimes we might have a temptation to post things, to say things, to do things, because we're hurt. But again, let's try to remember Matthew 18. Jesus is very specific. Jesus often talks in parables, but he does not in Matthew 18 talk in a parable. He is very direct. He's very specific. He says, go directly to that person. Go talk to them. And indeed, it's quite possible that you might need an apology. And indeed, that's how you work at reconciliation. Thanks. Thanks for your support.
We recognize we're calling you to a high standard, and it's not easy. It doesn't come naturally a lot of times for us. How do we work at this? Jesus is our example, and he's a model for us. In John chapter 4, Jesus talks to the woman at the well. Some of us are very familiar with that passage. Some of us maybe have never heard of it before. And I can't go over everything that's in this chapter. There's too much. but I encourage you over the weekend to read John chapter 4 and see what happens in this conversation. So let me just lift out 3 things really quickly that happens in this story. First of all, Jesus does not avoid going into enemy territory. He goes into Samaria. Now, Jews of his time avoided Samaria when they traveled. They would much rather walk many extra miles to avoid it. But Jesus goes to Samaria. In fact, the Bible says he had to go through Samaria. Not that he was forced to go there, but he had to stay true to who he was. Jesus was not afraid to go to those who were on the outside. And while on this trip, he asks a Samaritan woman at the well to give him a drink. Now, to the Jews of that day, this is a shocking situation for 2 reasons. First of all, she's a Samaritan, and Jews do not associate with Samaritans. In fact, we saw that verse on the screen a little while ago. I did not know that that verse was going to be up there. Secondly, she's a woman, and in that culture and time, men did not talk to women in public in those kinds of situations. So how do we apply that in our lives today? Well, I think like you've heard this morning, we can build bridges toward people who are outside of our comfort zone, even those that your friends might advise you not to talk to. This is difficult, and mistakes will be made, and there can be misunderstandings, but we need to keep trying. Secondly, Jesus found common ground, and through that common ground, he built community. He started with a simple request: may I have a drink? He knew that the Samaritans, if you went back in time, were related to the Jews in the past. They had a common ancestry. But he wanted to build on that commonality and share good news with her. So even though they were, quote, of different religions, he invited her to a closer walk with God. How do we apply that? I would say we need to find something we have in common, especially with new people that we're just meeting. It could be as simple as the weather, or what you did this past summer, or the Eagles and how great they're going to be this year, right? So share your truth and listen to their truth without judging what they say. Most political arguments in the end come down to a matter of means and ends. Both Republicans and Democrats have good goals that they want to achieve, but they disagree on how to get there. So maybe you can focus on the goals themselves and dialogue and discuss, how do we get there? Thirdly, Jesus valued people more than winning any arguments about religion or politics. Jesus asks the woman to bring her husband into the conversation, and this brings up an embarrassing point about her life. Jesus knows that, in fact, she has had 5 different husbands, and the man that she's with now is not her husband. This is a shocking failure on her part. But in spite of that, Jesus doesn't dwell on that. He still treats her with respect. Rather than pushing her away, in fact, he reveals more of himself to her. He becomes vulnerable, and he tells her that he is the Messiah. Not many people in the Bible that Jesus directly says that to. He's not focusing on her troubled past or even her current failings. He wants to help shape her future by telling her who he is. And his vulnerability builds a relationship, a bond built on trust and mercy. So how do we apply that? Well, it's all about relationship, not about winning an argument. If we are vulnerable and humble in our sharing, chances are that relationship will be strengthened, even though differences will remain. To summarize, Jesus shows us that 3 things are needed to build community. First of all, you need to build bridges, even with difficult people. You need to find common ground, things that you share. And thirdly, put people first. People are always more important than debates. And notice the result of this conversation. The Samaritan woman becomes a friend of Jesus and goes back to her town and shares about him with her friends and family. And the result is many believed on Jesus. Funny how that works. So in conclusion, with our Doc Talk today, we're living in a national and social media landscape currently that is filled with messages that do not encourage us to relate to people the way Jesus did. So we must look for role models in Jesus, through the Holy Spirit, and in our community of faith to help guide us. We've looked at civil discourse, we've looked at some tools and practices for managing conflict, and we've seen Jesus, who is God's perfect model, show us how it is done. So we urge you to put yourself out there like Jesus did, to take some risks socially, even though it's hard, to listen carefully, and to respect other people's perspectives, even when you disagree. And if we work at this, and it is work, our understanding of each other will grow, and more importantly, our relationships will grow as well. Thank you.
Again, thank you for your flexibility. Thank you for being here at this time. I have just a couple of announcements as we move forward. So if we could stay settled a little bit, if we could get the, did you find the one? Great. If we could get that up. This is, with the exception of, I believe, seniors, you are heading to the theater. Grades 9, 10, and 11. These are the locations for, you will have a mini-term meeting again. The 29th of October through November 1. We are exploring a new experience here at the school while seniors are off on their senior experiences. So please note these locations here for the next phase. And second thing, when we are done with the mini-term and the class meetings, you will head to lunch. When lunch is done, a bell will ring. We will report right back here to this spot to send you then off for the afternoon, okay? So now to these locations, then to lunch, then we'll meet back here before the afternoon. Thank you all.